Now that you understand the basic theory behind Altair, we're going to take a little time to step through some examples of common visualizations implemented in Altair. In particular, today we're going to do this in the context of what is called visual analytics. The basic idea here is that we create a series of visualizations that allow us to use our own intuitions and our own abilities to see patterns in visual information to explore data. The activities that we're going to be doing today in our next lecture and as part of the larger notebook that you have for this lesson are going to use the World Happiness Report dataset from 2016. You are welcome to use whatever dataset you would like. Just know that this particular dataset has already been cleaned up, so you don't have to do any extra data wrangling to get it working with the examples we're walking through. The one trick is you'll want to be sure to download this data set in advance and put it in the same directory as your current notebook in order to walk through the code as written during this lecture. So with that, let's go ahead and fire up our Jupyter notebooks and we'll go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned during our last lecture, we can load data into our visualizations in Altair using the pandas statistical package. So the way that we're going to do that in this case is we're going to start by importing pandas as PD, and then we're going to use pandas CSV reading functions to create a new data frame. So we're going to call this data frame data, and we're going to say pd.readcsv WHR2016.csv. And just as another quick reminder, make sure this file is in the same location as your notebook if you're going to import this way. We can confirm that our data has imported correctly by just taking a quick peek at the first few rows of our data set. So we can say data.head and hit Shift Enter to upload our data set and take a peek at the first few rows. What you'll see here is that our first few rows indicate that each row represents one country. We have a little bit of metadata about that country in terms of the region of the world it's from. Then we have a computed happiness rank. So this is of all of the countries in the data set, how does this country place in terms of how happy the country is? A computed happiness score and confidence intervals associated with that score, and a series of factors known to correlate with happiness. So if your data set looks like this, you're in a good spot. You are certainly welcome to do additional data wrangling. Any of your favorite pandas statistical functions or other kinds of operations that you apply prior to creating your visualization are totally fair game. But what we're going to do next is we're going to move into creating our visualizations with Altair. In order to create a visualization with Altair, the first thing we need to do is import the library. So what I'm going to say is import Altair as alt. Once I've imported this library, I can go ahead and make my charts. So the first part of any of my Altair commands is going to simply be alt. Then I'm going to bind my data to the chart. So I'm going to say alt.chart data. What this is going to do is it's going to say, I want to create a chart using the data frame called data. Next, we're going to move on and specify our geometric objects. So for this particular visualization, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore a little bit of what is the general distribution of happiness around the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this with a bar chart. So I'm going to say dot mark bar. And then I'm going to specify my aesthetics. And the way that I'm going to do this primarily is through my .encode function. So this encode function is going to let me specify how I want to map between my data sets and my visual channels. In this case, the first attribute that I want to pull out of my data set is the region. What part of the world is being represented? So I'm going to map that to my x-axis, my x position, by just simply saying x equals region. And you'll note here that region is specified as a string. It's within my quotation marks, and it also must exactly match the spelling and capitalization in my CSV data set. Next, I'm going to specify the y variable. So this is going to map to the height of my bar or the position of the bar on the y-axis. And the way I'm going to specify this is, again, using this simple declarative syntax. I'm going to say y equals happiness score. And again, this is going to bind my y value to my happiness score attribute in my data set. That's all we need to do to create our basic bar chart in Altair. I can hit Shift-Enter, run this cell, and you will see that I get a bar chart that shows me the distribution of happiness scores in different regions around the world. So happiness score distribution is one thing, but it doesn't tell us a whole lot about how we actually are computing happiness. What are the attributes that are present in a country that might contribute to high or low happiness scores? So one thing I might want to do is I might want to say, of all of these different attributes present in my data set, which ones are most tightly correlated with my computed happiness score? And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a scatter plot. A scatter plot is kind of the gold standard for assessing correlation between two variables. Prior studies have shown we're really good at estimating correlation with scatter plots compared to most other representations. So one of the interesting things with scatter plots in Altair is that changing from a bar chart to a scatter plot is more or less just a matter of updating the geometric object that you're using in your visualization. So to create my scatter plot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to again start with my alt.chart data. I'm going to bind to my current data sets, and then I'm going to use a circle mark. So I'm going to say mark.circle. And again, use my encode function. You'll notice, by the way, that I'm putting a little bit of extra space and some line breaks in the encode function. You do not have to do this in practice, but what you will see as we work through these examples is your Altair code can get pretty complicated. So breaking out your different visual channels onto different lines can just make it that much easier to actually track down what your code is doing. So in this case, what I want to look at is I just want to start by looking at the correlation between my happiness score and my health or life expectancy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bind health, life expectancy onto my X variable, and my Y position variable is going to bind to happiness score. Now all I have to do is run this and I get my scatter plot. So you'll notice the biggest difference between the structure of my scatter plot code and the structure of my bar chart code is simply that I've chosen a different geometric object. Here I've mapped things to a bar, down here I've mapped things to a circle. And by doing that, I get this scatter plot that shows me my happiness score on the y-axis, my life expectancy on the x-axis, and I can see, generally speaking, there seems to be a trend that happiness score and health are fairly well correlated. However, you'll note that we do see a little variation. This is not a perfect straight line pattern. So two hypotheses that we can generate about the source of variation are, one, that it's a noisy measure and there's simply inherently uncertainty associated with my happiness score. And two is that health doesn't perfectly explain our happiness scores. One thing we might want to do to try to understand our first hypothesis, that there's just simply some variation in our metric, is we might want to look at the relationship between health and happiness as a function of our relative rankings. Is it simply that trying to compute some sort of perfect score is what's introducing a lot of this variation, or is it something more? So to look at the relationship between health and ranking, one thing we can do is we can use a line graph. Line graphs are really good when we want to look at trends between one monotonically increasing variable and some other dependent variable. So in this case, health. So what we're going to do is we're going to say alt.chart data, and again, changing from a scatter plot to a line graph is largely a function of just switching the geometric object that we are using. So we're going to say alt.chart data, mark line, and then again we're going to use our handy encode function. And this time we are again going to map x to a variable. In this case, we care about the relationship between overall happiness rank. So we're going to map our x variable to happiness rank. And we're going to map our y variable to our health life expectancy. Now, if I go ahead and run this, I see I get a visualization that is generally trending downwards, but there's a whole lot of noise in this line. And what that tells me is that it's much more likely that some of this variation that we're seeing is due to happiness being more complicated than just simply measuring life expectancy. One last little bonus that I want to show you is how do we actually get charts out of Altair? So we've got a few ways we can do this. One, if you hover over your chart, you'll notice there's this 3 dots in the upper right corner. I can click that to save out my image as an SVG or as a PNG. And what this will do is this will export this visualization as an image. Our PNGs aren't interactive, but our SVGs often are. The other thing that we can do is we can export our charts as interactive web pages rendered using SVGs. And so what this will do is this will give us the code to actually drop our visualizations into an HTML and JavaScript page. Now, the way that we're going to do that is using the Altair save function. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and store my chart in a variable. So in this case, I'm going to say line graph equals alt.chart, so on and so forth. One thing you'll notice if you run this is that since we are storing this visualization in a variable, it is not going to render separately. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to render the chart to a file. So we're going to say linegraph.save. We're going to give the name of the graph we want to save. So in this case it's called linegraph.html. And we're going to specify the way we want this HTML file to render, and we're going to do that using our embed options command. And we're going to say renderer :SVG. Now, if I run this cell, you'll notice, again, nothing renders, but if I go to the directory that my notebook is stored in, I will see that I get linegraph.html. So what we can do with this is this will allow us to create really complex charts in Altair, and if we need to export them into a report, into a web page somewhere else externally that preserves the interactive capabilities of these charts, we can save them directly out this way. We aren't bound to keeping our visualizations in our notebooks. So that's it for this first walkthrough of the basics of Altair. And our next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the more complicated attributes that we can use. So thinking about how do we layer additional data into our chart to take us beyond our simple bar graph and line charts, and also look at how do we layer our charts together? How do we explore multiple facets of the data at once? I'm looking forward to walking you all through those in our next video.